Welcome to Secos, the podcast created by Ben, Moise, and Sneh, and powered by Cyber Viewpoint.
Right, and
This Cyber Viewpoint original series, the podcast where we decode modern cybersecurity strategies and real-world defenses for today's digital world.
exactly.
In this episode, we're stripping away the illusion of the secure perimeter. We are diving into the heart of the modern enterprise, the identity. We're going to explore how to govern every digital soul in your network and how to lock down the keys of the kingdom using privileged access management.
Because the old way it isn't working anymore.
It's really not. I mean, for as long as enterprise IT has been a thing, there's been this very comforting, almost universal architectural myth that organizations have bought into.
Right, the perimeter.
Yeah, the secure perimeter.
Yeah.
The classic castle and moat mentality. You know, you build this massive digital wall around your corporate network, you configure a really robust firewall, you set up your DMZ, and then you just operate on this fundamental assumption that any entity inside that fortress is inherently trusted.
Which is a huge assumption.
It's massive. You assume the threat actors are outside the walls, just actively trying to breach them. But that perimeter eroded years ago. Like, in a cloud-first, highly distributed world, the call is quite literally coming from inside the house.
It is. It's a profound architectural shift, and frankly, it's one that legacy security operations centers they're still really struggling to adapt to.
Yeah.
Because the perimeter, as a strict logical boundary defined by IP addresses and subnets, it simply does not exist in any meaningful way anymore. And the data reflects just how catastrophic this outdated reliance on network boundaries has become.
Exactly. To put a hard metric on that, the telemetry indicates that the average time it takes for an organization to identify a data breach is currently sitting at 206 days.
206 days. That
It's
is
insane. And I want you to address that operational reality for a second. Imagine an intruder roaming your digital home for over 6 months.
Just walking around in the dark.
Right. We aren't talking about a smash and grab here. We are talking about an advanced, persistent threat residing within your infrastructure, mapping your Active Directory, exfiltrating intellectual property, and establishing redundant persistence mechanisms for over 6 months before a single SOC analyst even sees an anomaly on a dashboard.
Because 206 days is a staggering dwell time. I mean, that takes us from late fall straight through to the middle of the following summer.
Yeah.
And the reason they can maintain that level of persistence without tripping alarms is really the core of our discussion today. In a modern environment, threat actors are no longer writing complex zero-day exploits to bypass your edge firewalls.
They don't have to.
No, they don't. They're simply logging in. If they can harvest a valid credential or hijack an active session token, they literally walk right through the front door. The intrusion detection systems are completely blind to the attack because, from the network's perspective, it just looks like authorized traffic from a legitimate employee.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct exactly how we secure infrastructure when the network perimeter is dead. We've got a stack of dense technical architecture guides here, cybersecurity frameworks specifically heavily referencing NIST 800-227 and advanced identity management strategies.
The really heavy reading.
Oh yeah, the fun stuff. We're going to strip away the illusion of network-based trust and dive into the actual control plane of the modern enterprise, which is the identity. We're going to explore the life cycle of governing every single digital entity on a network and how to lock down the critical infrastructure using advanced privileged access management, moving aggressively toward a model of zero standing privilege.
It's an operational imperative at this point. If identity is the new perimeter, we have to move past this rudimentary understanding of simple authentication. We need to look at the entire life cycle and authorization structure of what an identity actually is, how it accumulates risk over time, and how it is ultimately weaponized by an adversary.
Let's start with that life cycle, specifically the tiers of identity. Because when we talk about provisioning an identity in a corporate directory, we're actually merging several distinct data sets, right?
We are. It helps to visualize exactly what we are protecting. There are 3 main tiers. The foundational layer, tier 1, is my identity.
The permanent stuff.
Exactly. Permanent traits. Biometric data, your legal name, your date of birth. It's the immutable reality of you, the carbon-based user. But from an IAM perspective, the real risk surface begins when we hit tier 2 and tier 3.
Right, because tier 2 is the shared identity.
Yes. These are the attributes assigned by the organization, the corporate email address, the physical badge access, the VPN profile. These are issued temporarily based on a specific employment or vendor relationship.
And then tier 3.
Tier 3 is the abstracted identity. This is what groups that user into broader organizational roles or demographics like marketing, engineering, finance. The friction and, frankly, the security vulnerability arises because these assigned identities and roles do not remain static. They evolve constantly.
Which brings us perfectly to the workplace reality, using the joiner, mover, leaver framework.
Yes, the JML lifecycle.
The joiner phase is standard provisioning. It's the onboarding phase. HR triggers an event in the HRIS like Workday or whatever you use, which pushes a profile to the identity provider, creating the initial account and the base-level application access. Usually that part is heavily automated and relatively smooth.
Because businesses want people working on day one.
Exactly. But the mooter phase is where I consistently see enterprise access models completely break down. This is when authorization updates need to happen.
The mover phase is an absolute disaster area for role-based access control. When an employee transitions from, say, a level 1 support desk role to a level 3 engineering role, the IT provisioning teams are hyper-focused on ensuring that an employee has the new engineering access they need to be productive immediately. What they consistently fail to do is execute the deprovisioning of the legacy level 1 access.
I've always loved the analogy for this. Permission creep is like collecting lint on a sweater. You move through 5 different departments over a 10-year career at a company, and you just accumulate overlapping entitlement groups.
Like lint.
Exactly like lint. Suddenly, you have a mid-level manager in marketing who still retains read-write access to legacy customer service databases and financial forecasting tools from 3 roles ago. If an adversary compromises that one identity, they inherit a massive, bloated profile of access that bypasses internal segmentation entirely.
That is the exact mechanism of lateral movement we see in major breaches. And it gets exponentially worse in the lever phase. The termination phase is critical, but deprovisioning is historically the weakest link in the life cycle.
Oh, absolutely.
I was reading an anecdote in the source material about this. There was an employee whose highly sophisticated onboarding had them working on day 1, fully provisioned, all access granted instantly. But 2 years after they quit the company, their corporate voicemail still functioned.
2 years later.
2 years. If we connect this to the bigger picture, poor lever processes create dormant accounts. These are unmonitored backdoors that are just prime for exploitation.
Let's talk about the operational reality of those dormant accounts for a second, because I want you to really think about this. These are ghost accounts. The passwords are no longer being rotated by the user. No one is monitoring the inbox. But the directory object is still enabled, and the VPN access is still valid.
They're just floating out there.
Right. For an initial access broker who's scanning the dark web for leaked credentials, finding a dormant account with a decade's worth of accumulated lint permissions is the ultimate jackpot. They can operate inside the environment for months, and because the actual human associated with the account is gone, no one is there to notice the anomalous login alerts.
To combat that exact scenario, the industry has shifted toward formal identity governance and administration, or IGA.
Which is a beast of a topic.
It is, but it's essential. It's the transition from merely managing access to continuously governing and auditing it. IGA acts as a continuous digital census for your network. It tracks who you are and exactly what you're allowed to touch at any given moment.
But the reality of implementing IGA is incredibly complex, especially when we talk about the REP workflow. Request, approve, and provision.
Right.
In a mature environment, if a user needs access to an AWS S3 bucket, they can't just send a Slack message to the cloud infrastructure team and ask for it. They have to initiate a request in the IGA platform, which routes to the specific data owner for approval, and only then is the entitlement provisioned via an API call.
But the flip side of this governance engine is the access certification process.
Oh, don't even get me started. Access certifications are universally despised across the enterprise. It's an absolute nightmare for IT, but it's entirely necessary to prevent unauthorized lateral movement.
It's often called attestation, and it is a massive administrative burden. Once a quarter, line managers receive a sprawling dashboard listing all their direct reports and the hundreds of individual system entitlements they hold. The manager is required to certify that the access is still necessary.
And we know what actually happens.
Certification fatigue. Managers don't have the granular technical context to understand what some obscure string like AD Group Finance Legacy DBRED actually does, so they just rubber stamp approve the entire list to get back to their actual jobs.
Which completely defeats the purpose of the audit in the first place. The permission creep continues unabated. I know some of the newer IGA platforms are trying to solve this with context-aware micro-certifications, only asking a manager to review access when an anomaly is detected or when the user changes job codes. But we are still dealing with massive legacy technical debt in how these entitlements are structured.
To effectively map out that technical debt and fix it, we need to look at the architectural blueprint for identity security. We need to break down the 5 A's of enterprise IAM systematically. This moves us beyond the basics into real operational governance.
Let's break those down. The first A is authentication, or authn.
Right. Verifying who you are, proving you are who you claim to be. Now, we don't need to spend time explaining the basics of passwords or standard MFA to you, but the interesting shift here is the move away from phishable factors.
Yeah, moving toward FIDO2 standards, WebAuthn, hardware security keys, biometrics.
Exactly, because adversaries have completely automated the bypass of legacy MFA. If you are using SMS codes or simple push notifications, you are highly vulnerable to adversary-in-the-middle attacks or MFA fatigue bombing. Strong authentication is a prerequisite, but it leads directly into the second A, which is where the real security boundary lies.
Which is authorization.
Yes. What you can do, the equation to remember here is authorization equals privileges plus authentication.
So what does this all mean? It means knowing how to log in the authentication piece is completely useless without strict rules on what that login grants access to the authorization piece.
Exactly. Historically, authentication and authorization were tightly coupled within the application itself. Now we are seeing the rise of policy as code. You authenticate via an identity provider, but your authorization is evaluated dynamically by a central policy engine at the exact moment you request access to a resource.
It's a critical separation of concerns. If you have incredibly robust FIDO2 authentication, but your authorization model grants global read access across the environment to anyone who passes the authn check, you have failed at security.
Miserably. Which brings us to the third A, administration. This is the lifecycle management we just discussed, the IGA piece. It's the provisioning, the state changes, the integration with HR.
And where administration ensures the system functions, the fourth A, audit, ensures it functions legally.
Audit is the non-repudiation layer. It's proving who did what. In heavily regulated environments, think PCI DSS or HIPAA, you must be able to prove the chain of custody for access.
Right. When a regulator asks for the forensic timeline of an incident, you need immutable logs showing exactly who requested the access, who approved it, when it was provisioned, and crucially, when it was revoked.
Which flows perfectly into the final A, analytics. This is the transition from static rules to behavioral analysis.
Asking the question, is this user acting normally, or did they suddenly log in from another continent at 3 a.m.?
Exactly. We are taking that massive fire hose of audit logs and applying machine learning to establish a baseline of normal behavior for every single identity. This is the ultimate defense against the compromised credential.
Because if an attacker successfully harvests a session token and bypasses your hardware key, the analytics engine is what catches them.
The system knows that this specific user account typically accesses local marketing shares during East Coast business hours from a managed device. If that same account suddenly initiates a massive data pull from a highly restricted financial database at 3 in the morning from an unrecognized IP space, analytics flags the behavioral deviation. It can trigger an automated response, like forcing a reauthentication or severing the network session entirely.
That real-time behavioral evaluation is crucial, particularly when we start looking at the identities that actually hold the keys to the kingdom. We've talked about the standard user lifecycle, the lint on the sweater. But now we need to shift our focus to the administrative layer. We need to dissect privilege access management, or PAM.
Yes. We're moving beyond simple password vaulting here. When we talk about privileged access, we are not just talking about checking email. This is administrative root-level access. Domain administrators, database engineers, cloud infrastructure architects.
The God rights.
The God rights. If a standard user account is compromised, the blast radius is theoretically limited by their authorization profile. If a privileged account is compromised, the adversary can disable the endpoint detection and response agents, delete the audit logs, alter the immutable backups, and effectively own the entire enterprise architecture.
The traditional approach to IT administration was to just grant the engineering staff standing privileges. They had an admin account that was active 247, 365 days a year. Having those standing privileges is like leaving a spare key under the doormat of your most critical infrastructure.
It's incredibly dangerous.
It's operationally convenient for the engineer when they need to restart a service on a Saturday night, but the risk surface is simply indefensible. I want to highlight a really telling statistic from the research. 81% of Microsoft vulnerabilities could be mitigated simply by running as a standard user instead of an administrator.
81%, which is why the industry is pushing toward the holy grail of modern identity security. Zero standing privilege, or ZSP.
And the goal of ZSP is to have zero accounts with permanent administrative rights. Literally zero.
None. But to achieve that without breaking IT operations, we have to move to just-in-time access, or JIT.
Right. Break down JIT for us.
In a JIT architecture, privileges are granted only for a specific task and only for a specific duration. During normal operations, your top-tier engineer operates as a standard user. When an alert triggers, they log into the PAM portal and request elevation for a specific server.
So PAM should operate like a bank vault with a timed, one-time use key.
That's a perfect analogy.
Once the task is done, the key dissolves. The PAM system dynamically generates a highly complex randomized password or an ephemeral SSH certificate. It brokers the connection, silently injecting the credential into the session.
The admin never even sees the password. They get their root access, they fix the issue, and after a predefined window, the PAM system automatically severs the session and rotates the credential on the target server. The standing privilege simply dissolves.
This also introduces a critical psychological and behavioral shift for the engineering teams.
Yes, the observer effect.
Let's talk about that, because losing their permanent God rights can cause a lot of friction among IT admins.
It does. Nobody likes losing power. But we are talking about the observer effect in PAM, how monitoring actually changes user behavior. When an engineer knows that they are operating through a PAM proxy and that every keystroke, mouse click, and terminal command is being video recorded and logged, they become significantly more deliberate.
It introduces accountability, but it also fundamentally protects both the system and the admin.
Exactly. If a system goes down during a maintenance window, you don't have to guess what happened. You literally play back the session recording. It protects the infrastructure from malicious actors, but it protects the engineers from false accusations during an outage post-mortem.
Here's where it gets really interesting. PAM isn't just about a password vault for the IT guys anymore. It's universal. We have to talk about universal privilege management.
Because privilege doesn't just reside in the IT department anymore. It resides on every single endpoint.
Right. Which brings us to endpoint privilege management. You have to remove local admin rights from standard employee laptops. Historically, organizations granted local admin rights just to reduce help desk tickets for installing printer drivers.
Which is an absolute nightmare from a security perspective. If an employee with local admin rights executes a malicious payload from a phishing email, that ransomware executes with the local admin context.
It immediately disables the local EDR agent and starts beaconing out.
But revoking those rights en masse usually causes a user experience revolt. EPM solves this by shifting the paradigm from elevating the user to elevating the application. The user remains a standard user. If they need to run an approved application that requires admin rights, the EPM agent seamlessly elevates the privileges for that specific process ID in the background. The application runs, but the user remains restricted.
And we also have to secure third-party remote access, vendor PAM or VPAM.
This is effectively preventing supply chain attacks. We've seen catastrophic breaches where the initial intrusion vector was a third-party vendor who had been granted standing VPN access to the corporate network.
You hand a vendor a VPN client, you are extending your trusted perimeter to an unmanaged device on an untrusted network. VPM applies the zero trust and JIT principles to the supply chain. Vendors log into an isolated web portal. The VPM solution brokers an isolated monitored session strictly to the single application they are contracted to manage. No network-level access.
Lateral movement becomes architecturally impossible.
That tightly contained blast radius is essential. But all of this, the EPM, the VPM, the JIT vaults, mostly deals with human operators. And quite frankly, humans are becoming the minority of identities on the modern network. We need to introduce the machine problem.
It's not just carbon-based humans logging in anymore. We are dealing with a massive explosion of silicon-based identities. Service accounts, API keys, CI/CD pipeline runners, robotic process automation bots.
RPA bots are everywhere now.
They are. And machine identities vastly outnumber human identities in a modern cloud environment. They present a unique risk. Machines don't use MFA.
Right, a script can't answer a push notification on a smartphone.
Exactly. They operate 24/7, and historically, their credentials are often hard-coded into scripts by developers.
We still see it. You have a Python script designed to back up a production database, and the root database password is just sitting right there in the source code in plain text.
Which then gets committed to a GitHub repository. It's the equivalent of taping the combination to the front of the vault. These machine accounts require the exact same level of aggressive governance and secrets management as a human super administrator.
So we implement dynamic secrets management. We strip the hard-coded passwords out of the source code, and the application makes an authenticated API call to a vault at runtime to get an ephemeral credential.
We are applying just-in-time rigor to machines.
It fundamentally changes the attack surface, and this convergence of IGA, PM, and secrets management is what builds the foundation for the identity-centric perimeter.
What's fascinating here is how this transitions directly into NIST 800-207, which is the framework for Zero Trust architecture.
Let's get into Zero Trust. It's been co-opted by marketing a lot, but the core tenet is highly specific.
The core tenet of Zero Trust is that no implicit trust is granted based on physical or network location. Whether you are in the corporate office plugged directly into the switch or at a coffee shop on public Wi-Fi, every single request must be verified.
The network is assumed hostile. Identity is the new firewall.
To do this, you have to separate the control plane and the data plane. The control plane is where policies are evaluated. The data plane is where access is actually granted.
So when a request comes in, the control plane evaluates the 5 A's. It checks the FIDO2 auth, the IGA policies, the endpoint health, the behavioral analytics, and only if all of that is verified does it signal the data plane to establish a dynamic, micro-segmented connection to the specific resource.
The user never has broad network access.
But adversaries adapt. If you deploy a flawless zero-trust architecture, attackers don't just give up, they pivot. And this brings us to Identity Threat Detection and Response, or ITDR.
We have to look at this from the attacker's perspective. Since MFA blocks traditional password guessing, attackers pivot to session hijacking and token theft.
Because it's still easier to log in than to hack in.
Exactly. When you authenticate successfully, the server issues a session cookie. Attackers are using sophisticated adversary-in-the-middle frameworks to intercept these tokens. They set up a reverse proxy. You log in to what looks like your corporate page, you tap your hardware key, the real server validates it and issues the cookie, but the proxy intercepts it before it reaches you.
The attacker extracts that session token, imports it into their own browser, and completely bypasses the entire authentication flow.
And this is where ITDR comes in. ITDR focuses on analyzing the behavior of the identity in real time, detecting anomalies that traditional perimeter defenses miss. It monitors the identity infrastructure post-authentication.
So if an attacker imports that stolen session cookie and attempts to access an environment from a weird IP or starts a massive data export, ITDR detects the anomaly and can interface with the control plane to instantly revoke the session token.
It is the ultimate runtime safety net.
The scope of what we've covered today is massive. But to summarize the journey, identity security isn't a piece of software you install and forget. It's not a checkbox. It's a continuous journey towards zero standing privilege. You must verify identities constantly and ensure privileges are ephemeral.
You have to replace implicit trust with continuous verification.
So I want to ask you, the listener, directly. Audit your own life. Audit your organizational architecture. How many dormant accounts do you have floating out there in the ether? How many legacy service accounts have hard-coded credentials?
Every piece of unmanaged access is an open door.
Exactly. But before we close, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought from the source material. A look at the future of digital identity. We're talking about zero-knowledge proofs, or ZKPs.
This is a mind-bending concept. ZKPs represent a massive paradigm shift in how we handle authentication and privacy. In our current architecture, whenever we need to prove an attribute about our identity, we overshare data. We send the raw data to a centralized server,
Which creates massive honeypots of personally identifiable information.
Exactly. To understand ZKPs, we use the Peggy and Victor scenario. Peggy is the prover, Victor is the verifier.
Imagine being able to prove to a bouncer that you are over 21 without ever showing them your ID, your birth date, your name, or your address.
You prove the truth of the claim without revealing the underlying data.
In a digital context, Peggy's digital wallet performs a cryptographic computation locally, generating a mathematical proof that her employment status is valid based on an underlying credential. She presents the proof to Victor's server. Victor can cryptographically verify that the proof is sound and the claim is true, but he learns absolutely nothing about the underlying data.
No employee ID, no metadata. Just a cryptographically guaranteed true.
This mathematical wizardry might just be the ultimate solution to information leakage and privacy in the identity lifecycle. You cannot steal data from a server if the server never collected it in the first place.
It's the architectural endpoint of zero trust.
It really is. Well, that wraps up this episode of Secajoops, powered by Cyber Viewpoint. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the evolution of identity governance in PAM, stay tuned for more episodes where we unpack the strategies shaping modern cybersecurity. Until next time, keep your identities verified and your privileges ephemeral.